Hi, Sue. Another minute, we'll get started.
Oh, you'll tell me when to show my screen, right?
Yeah, I'll guide you through it.
Okay, no worries. I found a way to make it more American.
Excellent.
Now I'm like reading the data really quickly.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm really happy to have Sue Spaid with us tonight. I'd like to welcome everyone in the class and everyone that's joining us on YouTube. I'm Joanna Spitzner. I'm an associate professor in the School of Art, for those of you on YouTube. I'd just like to thank the SU Art Museum for hosting us on YouTube. And I'd also like to thank Sarah McCubry for making this connection and bringing Sue Spaid to us tonight. I'd ask all of you to please make questions and comments in the chat. You can do this both in Zoom and also on YouTube. And after Sue speaks with us, we'll have some time for some questions and answers. Next week, we have a panel discussion with Kevin Cole, Stephen Cozart, and Alan Edmonds. So I hope to see you all next week. I'm going to stop that share for a minute. Okay, so in prepared for tonight, I found it really daunting actually to encapsulate all the work that Sue Spaid has done. As a curator, she's worked in every kind of space that you can experience art, from small galleries to non-commercial galleries. She even ran her own. She's worked in big and small museums, both throughout the United States and in Europe. And she's currently based in Belgium, but is fortunate to be in Houston now, enjoying all that fun there right now. In parallel, Sue Spaid is a prolific writer, from art criticism to exhibition catalogs, books, and philosophical essays. Across them all, she brings together aesthetics, science, environmentalism, and philosophy for a deep engagement and how art means and enacts. I encourage you to go to her website. There's tons of stuff there. Her most recent book is The Philosophy of Curatorial Practice, Between Work and World, which looks at the relation, how objects are in a relation amongst one another, how the testing hand of the curator illuminates particular aspects of all the work in relation, and also how spectatorship all play a role in determining the meaning of artworks. In 2002, she coined the term ecovention, which is ecology and invention. An ecovention is an artist-initiated practical action with ecological intent. And so it is my honor tonight to introduce Sue Spaid. So welcome. I look forward to hearing you.
Wow, thank you very much for that introduction. It looks like you had to do a lot of research. Anyway, thank you to Sarah for making this link, and Joanna for organizing, and Syracuse University for hosting me or for inviting me. And I have visited your campus before. So anyway, I went to your wonderful museum, right? Isn't the Everton at Syracuse?
The Everson, yeah.
The Everson, yes. I've been to the beautiful Everson Museum. So long time ago, maybe 20 years ago, but I did visit. Anyway, and today we're having more upstate New York weather than Texas weather. So it's kind of an exciting novel reminder of climate change and all of its glory. Okay, so I guess I'm going to share my screen, and let's see, why don't I, oh, here it is. Let's see, I want to go to the first from the beginning. Okay. So I want to just give a little bit of a background. I became very interested in, well, my first book, Ecovention, that Joanna mentioned in 2002, had a little section on biodiversity. And in those days, there weren't that many artists interested in biodiversity, but there was, of course, if you know Brandon Ballinger, who I'm going to talk about, Lynn Hall. Like Lynn Hall wasn't necessarily interested in biodiversity, but she was probably the first person who told me that she was creating art for animals, or she wasn't interested in making art for humans. And that struck me in 2000 as very odd. I mean, now it seems very normal. Everyone is very interested in the non-human and our relationship with animals. But to have an artist say, oh, I only make art for animals, was like, okay, well, that's interesting. Anyway, so 20 years ago, biodiversity was actually just getting coined. It's a mix of biology and diversity. And in my talk, Be Biodiverse, I like to make these talks that have a kind of mini manifesto, you know, encouraging you to think more about biodiversity and to think about it as something in your life with value. And I'm going to try to explain why it has value to every human as well as every animal and every plant. And the second title, Bees, Art and Diversity, I originally organized this talk for an exhibition on bees. And as you've heard before, bees are kind of a linchpin. I think that the famous quote of Einstein is, if the bees disappear, the humans will be fast to follow them. But the other word that struck me, I mean, it sounds maybe redundant to say be biodiverse, bees, art and diversity. But I really want people, one of the things I've learned from doing my research in biodiversity is that human diversity is just as important as biodiversity. And that's why cities are so alive and so full of energy, because all the different kinds of people that live there are bringing all of their interests and all of their backgrounds and all of their languages. And you'll see as we go on, there's actually a very interesting connection between linguistic diversity and biodiversity. It's totally surprising. Okay. So I just want to start with this quote. If you can only have one takeaway from my talk from today, it's this quote. We can't just put all biodiversity in a museum and expect it to survive. Biological diversity depends on human diversity. So this kind of thinking is a really eye-opening experience for me, because normally we think of biological diversity as having nothing to do with humans, only that humans are destroying. You know, we normally think of the Anthropocene as human life putting pressure on animal and plant life. I'm sure you've heard of the term the sixth extinction. But I love the fact that if we think that biological diversity depends on human diversity, and then we focus on human diversity with the goal to increase biological diversity, I think we already have something in motion that would be very positive. Okay, last year was the International Year of Plant Health, which didn't get discussed at all in the middle of the pandemic. I think we were mostly interested in human health. And this year is the International Year of Fruits and Vegetables. And so I'm always very interested in whatever the United Nations assigns as something to focus on. And I try to not only advertise it, but I try to do art projects related to whatever the topic is. And I don't really know yet what's going to happen with fruits and vegetables, but I can tell you in 2015 was International Year of Soil, and my entire life was soil. I wrote papers on soil, I researched soil, I went to conferences on soil. It was a dirty mess, let's just say that. No, I'm teasing. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So I'd like to dedicate this talk to my chicken, Maria Theresa. You can see her photo, she's here, that's Maria Theresa. She's no longer living, she died in 2019, and I didn't even get her until 2018. So when I got her, she was 4 years old. And I got her as part of an art project that I'll discuss at the very end. But Maria Theresa taught me a lot. Living with chickens has taught me a lot. The first thing that you learn is that chickens are, you learn that chickens have school, and chicken mothers are teaching their children things all the time, and they go through a certain kind of methodology. One day she teaches them how to play dead, how to do how to do a dirt bath. I mean, there's lots of lessons being learned every different day, and you can see her intentionally teaching her children. But the other thing that was interesting to me so Maria Theresa is not a purebred chicken. She's the 20th or the 15th generation of a project where she's continually crossbred with a different species. But her last species was an Austrian breed called the, oh no, I'm having a senior moment. Doesn't matter. It's an Austrian breed. So I gave her this Austrian name, Maria Theresa, because Maria Theresa was the first Austrian empress and the last of the the last of the Habsburg Empire. So she's a very important lady. She's the mother of Marie Antoinette. And as part of this art project where I got a chicken and then I had to become a citizen scientist and record her life in all different kinds of ways. I recorded all her babies. I recorded all the things that she did and everything. So in exchange for recording her, I had my DNA swabbed and I got to know a little bit more about myself. And I learned later that I actually am related to Maria Theresa. I don't think it's that rare. Probably a lot of you in the audience are also related to Maria Theresa, but it was kind of an interesting coincidence that I had named my chicken Maria Theresa prior to learning of my genetic background. Anyway, but with biodiversity, she's an example of a very biodiverse chicken who's been interbred with all these different species for the purpose of making her immunity system stronger. It turns out the less pure you are, the stronger you are. And it probably applies to human beings too, but it's still up for grabs. Okay, so this talk, all of my research in biodiversity takes inspiration from my first book, Ecovention, and the research I was doing on biodiversity, and this is what struck me. So I found this quote. The quote was, of the 9 countries where 60% of the world's remaining 6,500 languages are spoken, 6, Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, India, Zaire, which is the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Australia, are also centers of megadiversity for flora and fauna. And that really struck me. I thought, wow, how could that be? Why or how is there a relationship between human language and biodiversity? So just for fun, I made this bold statement that biodiversity is directly proportional to cultural diversity. I'm not sure that that's true, but I made this kind of speculative leap based on this statistic. But certainly in 2002, I didn't know it was true. In 2002, it was just kind of like, hey, I can make biodiversity really important. I can make both cultural diversity important if I link it to biodiversity, and I can make biodiversity important if I link it to human diversity. So that's sort of the beginning of my interest in biodiversity. And then the next thing you knew, okay, well, I'll tell you in a minute about another project. So then I was invited to write a paper in philosophy about the relationship between biodiversity and aesthetics. And you'll see in a minute that I went back to this quote and attempted to prove it. So initially, I just saw this statistic about language and species and decided, oh, let's just make a nice assumption that there's some relationship between biodiversity and cultural diversity. And then almost 15 years later, I attempted to prove it. Okay, so so now this is really interesting. So this is a list of the Earth's most biodiverse countries, the 50 most biodiverse countries. And almost all of them, all but 5 were colonies. And this is kind of important because, it's kind of counterintuitive. You would think that, as it turns out, that none of the countries on this list are the colonizers. That's what's important. I guess China or Japan was kind of a colonizer, but for the most part, you don't have any European countries. And it doesn't really surprise me because if you go back to the 16th century in Europe, you learn that the Europeans were cutting down their trees, they were making boats to sail around the world. And of course, they're more monolingual. Each country has a national language. And the countries that are listed here, most of them are also countries where lots of different dialects are spoken, or lots of different indigenous languages. Like Brazil probably has, I don't know, 200, 300 languages. I don't really know, but it was on the list of the 6,500 languages split between 6 countries. I don't think it has 1,000 languages, but it could. But the point I'm trying to make is that many of these countries were colonies, all but 5 were colonies. And somehow, despite being colonies, they were never turned into sort of monolithic language centers, and they were never turned into countries that are with lower biodiversity. They were somehow able to keep their language and their biodiversity intact. And for me, that's a very important discovery. And I mean, there's a lot of different suppositions. One supposition could be these people didn't travel very far. They lived in their own little neighborhood. So they knew their species, they protected their species, they protected their environment. The people in the next neighborhood spoke a different language. Maybe they knew a couple words, but the point is that they were very focused on a local environment. Or maybe, in fact, they were really protected. Maybe there was a river between the 2 communities. It's very difficult to make any kind of speculation about why there's this connection between cultural diversity and biodiversity. But I actually think that one thing, in a minute, I will come up with 3 different sort of theories about this. It's just interesting to look at the list of the countries, and I've sort of broken it down. So there's 12 that are Asian, 7 that are from North America, 11 from South America, 2 from Oceania, and 18 from Africa. Those are the most biodiverse countries, or those are the countries that are the most biodiverse in those continents. And I think the only countries that weren't really colonies are China, Thailand, Japan, Nepal, and Iran. So, and those are all in Asia. All the other countries were at one time a colony. And they somehow, I guess it's because of cultural diversity that they were able to survive colonization. I don't know. But we do know that colonization did kill many people. I mean, in Mexico, 20 million people died as a result. Probably the same in the States. I don't really know this. I don't know the exact statistic in the States. Okay. So this is just a kind of a heat map of Europe, but it tells you something very interesting. So the lighter the color, the less animal species. So it kind of makes sense that it's really cold up here. You're going to have less terrestrial, not animals, they're calling it terrestrial, less terrestrial. And then these are the heat, this is where you're having most of your species in northern Spain and in southern France and northern Italy, and then Central Europe, and then going over to Greece and the Southeast. And the same thing for the water. So you have this, it seems to me the area around England is having the most amount of species, or the UK, and then up here there's fewer, and here there's fewer, and as the further you get away from Europe, there's fewer. It's just to give you an idea of something that scientists know. Species are regularly counted. Since for almost 30 years, there's been a convention on biodiversity, and different countries, almost 200 countries are signed up to the convention, and citizen scientists and regular scientists, lots of people are counting species. But now that we looked at Europe, we can look at the States. So what's interesting about the States is that, okay, so this is telling you, red is the most amount of species, blue is diverse species, but fewer. But what's interesting is that they say that in the States, the protected lands, there's a what do you call it? Disparity between protected lands and species. So apparently, the Southeast has a lot of, has more different kinds of salamanders, more different kinds of amphibians, whereas the West Coast has more different kinds of mammals. And the point being that almost all of the protected lands are in the West Coast. So there's now going to be a movement to change, to sort of start to open up more protected lands. Oops, I got there already. So to sort of organize the protected lands to match the species, because it doesn't make sense to have all your protected lands for different, you know, that don't really match your species. Anyway, that's just this is a recent discovery. And anyway, I don't know if there's probably lots of questions about this, but you can see these, there's nature reserves, national parks, national monuments, habitat, protected landscapes, and sustainable use of natural resources. So these are all the different things that allow species to thrive outside of language. I mean, this is just habitat related. And then here they're telling you who owns the lands, whether it's federal, state, or jointly owned or Native American. Okay. So in this talk, these are some of the main points I want to make. I want to suggest that biodiversity can be a bioindicator for human cultural engagement and human well-being. That's something we never think about. We don't necessarily connect biodiversity to ourselves as human beings. But you know, a lot of people are wondering, how do we judge whether nature is beautiful? Most people will say, oh, wild nature is beautiful, or pristine nature is beautiful, or that's a beautiful landscape. But it seems to me that if we were to think about biodiversity, we might be able to find places that we don't ordinarily think of as beautiful as kind of being beautiful. And a great example of that is like a swamp, where you can have many different species all living together. But as human beings, we may look at it and go, that's not very interesting, or that's really ugly, or we should fill in that hole, that muddy hole. But the point I'm trying to make is that by rethinking how we judge nature's beauty, if we judge it in terms of biodiversity, maybe in fact, we could have a fairer idea of beauty that is more inclusive than just simply what humans like. And I call this notion biodiverse beauty, because in fact, you're gauging beauty, but you're also assessing it. And you're assessing it from the perspective of biodiversity. And then I'm going to give you at least 25 examples of artists who have actively defended and improved biodiversity. And then finally, I'll return to this project I told you about at the beginning that was called Perfect Stranger. And the artist took my DNA swab, then shows this chicken, and then it's a Zomtaler. That's what it was. I think I forgot. Couldn't put my finger on the Austrian chicken. And the artist's name is Koen van Mechelen. Okay. So I think I told you that in 2002, when I was researching my first book, and I came across this idea that there's some sort of the 6,500 languages exist in 6 countries. And then in 2015, I went back to this to try to prove it. I tried to go from what could be a fact to what could be a theory, for example. And so the fact is that a breadth of human languages correlates with biodiversity, right? We know that there's 6,500 languages in the in the 6 countries that are the most biodiverse. And so then I thought, okay, well, how can I make a theory to explain this? So I came up with this theory: human beings who value their culture protect their natural environment. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because the human beings who value their culture, they think of their environment as part of their culture. They do not separate it. And this is not unique to Indigenous people. It's particular to Indigenous people, but wherever you grew up, you have a memory of your environment and you return to it. Not everybody, but lots of people will return to it, and they have a special appreciation for the communities that they've lived in. And I think that's normal. And we try to protect those communities in which we've grown up in. So those who especially value their cultures will do what they can to protect their natural environment. That's why people are saying we don't want another strip mall. That's why they're saying we don't, we don't want this development. We're a farm. We like our farmland, whatever. The point is that wherever people live, they're more likely to protect their environment. And it's particular to indigenous people, and it's particular to city folk too, who are fighting for the land or their environment that they're familiar with. Then I tried to make the claim that since languages tend to survive where diverse species thrive, so now we're no longer talking about people, we're talking about biodiversity. Respect for habitat encourages cultural diversity and biodiversity. So it occurred to me that the animals and plants that are part of a person's environment they're going to try to protect those too. So they're going to also value them. So if you grow up in a place, for example, in the United States, we have fireflies. Not every country has fireflies, but when the fireflies disappear, people go crazy, right? They're like, oh my God, what have we done? We want to get our fireflies back. So the species that we know and that we live with and that we appreciate, we do try to protect them, and we do try to do what we can to preserve our habitat that we've grown up with. And then finally, biodiversity is relational and interactional with human beings. And this is very important because it turns out that even though you would think that the more human beings there are, the worse it is for species, that's true. It turns out that spaces like cities have much greater biodiversity than rural environments. So it turns out that the fact that in cities where people are speaking many different languages and they're bringing all of their different cultural diversity and also biodiversity with them, I think a lot of people will come to a city and they'll start growing whatever plants that they knew from their original country. Those kinds of things tend to increase the biodiversity. And now more recently, ethnobotanists have made the claim that whenever we lose linguistic diversity, we lose biodiversity, because in fact, the knowledge that comes with linguistic diversity is what is needed to discover a lot of these plants. Because in English, we don't have all the names of all the different species that exist, but in other different languages, they know the names, they know the properties, they know where they are, and they can retrieve them or identify them. And in English, we're really limited to what species have been identified and codified in English. Okay. So more recently, there's the claim that human well-being and biodiversity are intrinsically linked. And that's a wild claim, because in fact, human well-being is definitely the goal of every human being. So if in fact human well-being and biodiversity are intrinsically linked, then biodiversity should be the absolutely most important thing that there is. And of course, that's not really the case yet, but it would be nice if it were. Okay, so unfortunately, these diagrams are way too small, but I'm happy to give Joanna a copy of my PowerPoint, and then you can see the diagrams in a larger scale. But everywhere you see this brown HWB, human well-being, the purpose of this this slide is to show that human well-being is linked in all sorts of different areas of anyway, if for some reason it shows up on the PowerPoint, but it doesn't really show up, excuse me, it shows up on the PDF, but it doesn't really show up on this PowerPoint. But the point of the slide is to show that it's really linked in all different kinds of ways. And this is the research of this scientist, Shahid Naheem, who works at Columbia at the Earth Institute. Okay, so this is another one of his discoveries, is that there's a relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. So this is the quote: although scientists cannot prove causation, that means it's not really there's a corollary, but not a causation. Although the scientists cannot prove causation between biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, geobotanist Michael Sherlorenzen captures growth rising asymptotically as the number of different trees in the canopy increase. So you have a forest, there's many different kinds of trees. The more different kinds of trees, the more trees there are. That's the observation. Okay, his research was inspired by the ecosystem consequences of biodiversity loss, the evolution of a paradigm, which is a paper from Shahid Naeem. So the conclusion is that ecosystem functioning depends on biodiversity, and biodiversity is an independent variable. So ecosystem functioning is just a term that scientists use to try to understand the health. It's actually the well-being of nature, the well-being of the forest, the well-being of the ecosystem. And I mean, it's not a term we would apply to humans. We don't talk about our ecosystem functioning, but we do talk about well-being. And in this case, you know, nature's well-being depends on biodiversity. The more different kinds of species, the more they're interacting with each other. One of the most important, so the first question might be like, well, why does it really matter if there's so many species? I think a better way to look at the question is it really matters if there's really few species. And the example of that is, you know, invasive species, the most famous one being, the one that grows all over Kentucky, and anyway, it starts with a K. Why can't I remember? Kudzu. It doesn't matter. What?
Kudzu.
Kudzu, yes, exactly. Kudzu. So you have a species like kudzu, it arrives and there's fewer and fewer and fewer species. And so it's because, and the more the kudzu takes root, the less chance there is for the babies of the existing plants to arrive. And it becomes a kind of a, what do you call it? It just spirals down. So the view that the more different kinds of species are, it usually means that there's a better use of resource depletion. The plants or the animals are working well together. They're thriving as opposed to you know, one species taking over and the existing species suffering. Okay, so these are some more different kinds of what do you call it? Different kinds of charts that show you the example of more species. So for example, if there's more species, there's greater seed dispersal, which makes sense. There's what they call more litter respiration and more decomposition. There's more carrion removal. Carrion removal is when the animals are dead. So a big animal in the sky will come down to the earth and will take the carrions away, and they'll take away the dung, but there'll be more trampling and there'll be more stream respiration. So it just shows you that this is just these are different charts to show you there's more carbon cycling, there's more cattle forage. They're just trying to show you that the more species you have, the more different kind, the greater the activity of the ecosystem. Okay. I guess we could go to the next one. All right, so I mentioned at the very beginning that that I see biodiversity as a way to assess biodiverse beauty. I don't really need to say that much about it, but I'm always looking for tools that take us away from our human ideas of beauty, because every one of us has a different idea of nature's beauty. Some of you will only think mountains are beautiful. Some of you will only think farms are beautiful. Some of you will think, you know, as humans, we all have our personal preferences that I don't really know where we get them, maybe from our past experiences. But I think that if we start to link beauty to biodiversity, I think that we will begin to see beauty in places we haven't seen it before. And we will also appreciate the way places are becoming more biodiverse. Like, one of my fantasies is that every city in the world, when you're driving into it and it says, "Welcome to Podunk Estates," or whatever, it says home to 73 species, you know, so that people have a real sense of pride, even about the species they don't see, even about the, you know, the insects that are there and the birds that are, all the different species that people don't even know about. I mean, people tend to know mostly about the birds and some of the larger mammals. But I think it would be really wonderful if we had a greater appreciation for the more different kinds of species in each of our communities. And I must say that part of the reason why cities are considered so biodiverse is because of the zoo and the botanical garden. And you could say, oh, that's kind of cheating. Well, it's not really cheating if you think about one of those maps I showed you before. I think I'm going to turn, should I turn the light on? Okay, I'm sitting here a little in the dark. Okay, so those other places that we talked about with biodiversity, those preserves are all, you know, forests, you know, they're national parks or preserved natural preserves or national preserves. So it shouldn't be surprising that zoos and botanical gardens contribute to the city's biodiversity. But at the same time, the whole purpose of a zoo and a botanical garden is to make people aware of species. So I think it has this double bond where not only does it become not only does it give people access to different species, but it simultaneously makes them more aware, makes them more appreciative. And I think that really is part of the reason why indigenous people are so appreciative of their environment, is because they actually know what's in their environment. The more we know about nature and the more we know, the more we can identify plants and animals, the more we're going to take care of it. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on in the art world. So I told you that I originally made this talk for an exhibition about bees. So I wanted to talk about some early projects. So this is from Patricia Johansen, who doesn't live so far from you guys. She lives in Buskirk. I guess it's near Albany. I guess you're what, an hour from Albany? I don't know. Anyway, but it sounds crazy. It doesn't sound very interesting in 2020 or 2021. But in 1969, when she made this drawing, it was a urban agriculture honeybees that with the view to be growing honeybees in an urban environment, not growing honeybees, but raising honeybees. It seemed like a crazy idea because, in fact, beekeeping was pretty much illegal in New York State, well, especially in the city, until really recently. I think 2010 is when it was no longer illegal to be a beekeeper in the city. So urban beekeeping was was not even a possibility in 1969. In 2012, some artists called and did different kinds of seeds, and they were selling them in the gift shop at Documenta, and they had a special seed for growing cornflower, which is one of the favorite flowers of the honeybee. And you can see they say this is their manifesto: plant, pollinate, proliferate, propagate, propel the seeds of revolt. Anyway, they decorated each seed packet. Then this is a half American, half Dutch artist, Linda Molenaar, who lives in Amsterdam. And here she's sort of doing a performance art piece imitating the bees. And this is actually a Mark Thompson, an American artist, who did a piece, who is a beekeeper and did performance art with his bees in the 70s and 80s. And I think Abby is still alive, Mark Thompson. And this is his famous Live in Hive. Okay, so that's just a kind of example about artists working with bees. But one of the most important examples of a biodiversity is Alan Sanfa's time landscape. And you can see he came up with the idea in 1965. It took him 13 years before he could get a space to actually do it. It's really kind of a crazy project because he proposed it and everyone thought he was crazy. People said there's no way these species will ever grow in New York City, because he wanted to make a little plot of land that had all of the species that would have been there when the Dutch settlers came in the 17th century, or this, yeah, I think it's the 17th century. So in order to make this mini forest in New York City, he had to go upstate and grab seedlings, and you can see what it looked like when he first planted it. Well, I guess that wasn't when he first planted it, but that's one of the early years. This is the drawing. This is, oops. This is the drawing. This is reality. This is what it looks like today. It has a nice sign. You can't miss it. It's very close to NYU. LaGuardia. It's effectively LaGuardia Place. And at the same time, Sanfa had this idea for an indigenous forest to grow in the Manhattan, which everyone thought was impossible. He also had the idea that he noticed there were lots of empty spaces in New York City. And wouldn't it be great if every empty lot or every empty space could be taken over by the city and turned into like, he was calling them green spaces. And in fact, that's exactly what the city of New York eventually did. If you walk around New York City, you'll occasionally see these signs that say New York City green space. And then you're like, oh, strangely, when I wrote the 2002 book, I called up the Parks Department in New York City and I said, oh, did you get your idea for your green spaces from Alan Solfus? And they're like, oh, we never heard of Alan Solfus. We don't know anything about what you're talking about. So anyway, it's a kind of artist's idea that got out there and got implemented, but people don't remember that it was really originally an artist's idea. Okay, so this is a Dutch artist, Hans de Vries, who he now lives in Denmark. He no longer lives in the Netherlands, but at the time, he was basically a farmer who was a conceptual artist, and he was turning all of his everyday activities into like artist books. And this is a very fun artist book. Every time he found roadkill or a dead animal on the road, he would take a picture of the place where he found them. He would make a map, he'd make a description, and eventually he made an entire book. This is called the dead animal book, the Dode Beestenboek, the dead animal book. Anyway, but in 1971, he was invited to be in a biennial. Oh, actually, it's very important. It's Sonsvej Buiten de Perken. It's like the first outdoor exhibition in Europe. Everything was outdoors, and it was all over the country of Netherlands. It wasn't just in one area. You had to pretty much drive all over the country to see all the different outdoor works. Anyway, so he's invited to be in the show, and he proposes to do a species count of amphibians, insects, and moths. And initially he wanted to do a 20-kilometer square area, but that was way too big. So he did a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, which is still pretty big. But anyway, in my mind, this is really before anyone, I don't know of any scientists doing species counts in 1971. Species counts are really something that came along in the 90s. Maybe people were doing them individually, but it wasn't a big topic. And so, so in my mind, it's interesting that an artist would think to do a species count as early as 1971. Unfortunately, when he exhibited his species count, I don't know what it looked like because I've never seen an image. He exhibited in a museum. Well, it was like in an off space. It was an alternative space. But no sooner did the show open than the cleaning crew threw everything away. It's not the first time the cleaning crew threw the art away. I've had that experience several times with artists. And anyway, so once his exhibition or his display or his presentation had been removed from the exhibition, he hung this kind of cryptic sign: communication difficult due to the lack of participation of the public. I don't know. I think it's actually a pretty funny sign, but very cryptic. Okay, so a few years later, this another New York-based artist, Betty Beaumont, she was worried about the that the coral reef off of Fire Island was disappearing. And this is, I mean, these days, of course, we have huge problems with coral reef due to coral reef burning, right? The too much because of greenhouse gases, the coral reefs are all overheating, burning, disappearing. The species are at risk. At this time, the problem wasn't due to necessarily, if it was due to greenhouse gases, no one had identified that. They just identified that the fish species were declining, and the only way they were going to get more fish species is if they had a proper coral reef, because the species use coral reefs for spawning. So she did this massive project. I mean, she claims, I don't really know the truth. She claims she raised $3 million to do this. She worked with a coal-fired electric plant in Ohio. They made something like 17,000 fly ash bricks. Fly ash is a residue from making coal. And this is a simulation of the bricks. She rented a barge. She filled the barge with these bricks, dumped them off the coast of Fire Island, and voila, these days this coral reef is healthy again. Well, it's difficult to know whether or not this is an imaginary project or a real project. I would love for someone to go and make a movie of this. But anyway, it's important, I guess. I mean, she claims that she really did it. Hopefully, if she didn't do it, she would just say it's conceptual art, and it would be a good idea to do. But anyway, one day, someone we know will scuba dive 70 kilometers off the coast of Fire Island and find out what is actually going on in the water there. But anyway, I hope it's a true project, because I've been promoting it for 20 years as a true project. Okay, this is another Dutch artist, Herman de Vries. The other one was Hans de Vries. And Herman de Vries is way more famous than Hans de Vries. And in 2015, he represented the Netherlands at the Venice Biennale. And what you're looking at are each of these different colors. You could call it a natural pigment, but what it actually is earth rubbing. So he is this guy who's gone around the world and he's made a museum of 8,000 samples of earth, and just to show how diverse the earth is. Now, if any of you ever do any farming or work with soil, then you know that soil is this amazing, they say that 1 tablespoon of soil has something like 3 million different microbes or different species inside of it, different microbes. So each of these, well, I mean, effectively they're living. They're full of these microbes, and the microbes are what give, between the microbes and the minerals, are what give the soil its particular color. And I mean, his work is really spectacular because it totally appeals to humans. You know, humans love color. And then you learn that, wow, it's not color from a chalk or color from some natural source. It's actually something he went out and made. He found the source and made the earth rubbing and collected it himself. Okay, so this is another project by Patricia Johansen. She was the one who did the urban honeybee farm in the 60s. Well, she didn't do it, she proposed it. This is a huge project that she did in Dallas, where this is a lagoon. The walkway didn't exist in the lagoon, and it's a combination of a lagoon and a place where a lot of stormwater from all over the city is being dumped. But even though stormwater was being dumped in this lagoon, at one time it had been thriving, and at one time it had a lot of different species, and it had vegetation, and it was healthy. But something happened in the late 60s, early 70s. It started to die. There were invasive species. It became fewer and fewer species. And on this lagoon sits the Cotton Bowl of Cotton Bowl fame, but also at the time, the Dallas Museum of Art and the Dallas Science Museum. Both institutions have since moved, but the Cotton Bowl is still there. Anyway, so the director of the Dallas Museum of Art saw one of Patricia Johansen's exhibitions in New York City and thought, I wonder if this lady could bring back to life the lagoon in Dallas. And he grew up in Dallas, so he had a childhood memory of this lagoon being really healthy. And once it wasn't healthy, it was like covered over in algae. You know, there were fewer fish species, there were fewer waterfowl, there were fewer plants. I mean, I'm sure you've seen lakes that are dead. This was a dead lagoon, which is effectively a dead lake. Anyway, but when Patricia got there, she realized that the problem was that there was no middle food web species, so that there was no aquatic insects, snails, there was, and the most important thing is that there was no literal, there was no literal edge, and the literal edge is the vegetation that surrounds every lake, and apparently 75% of the pond life depends on that littoral edge. And when last year we were in Sweden, and if you ever go to Sweden, I mean, they have a million lakes anyway, but you'll see every lake is unbelievably healthy. They all have this massive green space that encloses them. And you can only imagine that, well, that's probably why they're so healthy. This lagoon had lost it. So she kind of worked with some scientists to decide what to do. And the first thing she said was get rid of the Asiatic ducks and stop fertilizing the grass, because the grass fertilization has lots of nitrogen. If you dump nitrogen in any kind of body of water, it just grows out of control. And then all of a sudden you have a lot of ducks, and then you have the ducks. Anyway, it just spirals out of control. But anyway, so she worked with scientists, and they added different species. They added more plants. They added more floating plants to clean the water. They add different submerged plants, fish species, turtles, ducks, and then it came back to life. But recently, if you Google this, you'll read lots of very sad stories. It doesn't seem that the city of Dallas, I mean, basically, this is the city of Dallas's spiral jetty, and they should take better care of it, and they should appreciate it, and they should understand that it's an artwork by a very important living American artist. But unfortunately, there just seems they'd rather just put a fence around it and tell people not to go anywhere near it than to deal with how to maintain it and keep it in good health. But that's a separate issue. But it's a good example of how artist projects can fall into disrepair because the community doesn't attempt to maintain them. Okay, this is another Patricia Johansen project that's very popular and very well maintained and very successful. So in San Francisco, the city was dumping its stormwater and its wastewater, everything into the Pacific Ocean, and was getting fined every day, something like $1 million a day. And the question was, what are they going to do? How can they, how the EPA was very upset with them. And of course, it doesn't seem very San Francisco to be dumping so much waste into the Pacific Ocean. So, and of course, this only happened when it rained. So it wasn't like every day, but it was when it rained and they had so much water, and their wastewater treatment system was not working properly. So what they decided that if they did it as an engineering project, they'd have to get lots of bids, they'd have to vote on it. It might take 10 years before they solved the problem. But if they did it as an art project and they hired Patricia Johansen, it could happen very quickly for a fraction of the cost. So they hired Patricia Johansen, and she basically built a holding tank under this sculpture. So it's a holding tank that, instead of dumping all this stormwater runoff and wastewater and all this stuff into the Pacific Ocean, it can be held and then maybe either released much slower or treated. I don't know if it's even, maybe it's treated before it's released. I don't know the details, but there is a holding tank underneath, and then on top is this, she calls it the endangered garden. You know, at low tide, it's a place where humans can enjoy. They can walk around. It's sort of shaped like a snake. But at high tide, it becomes habitat. So imagine at high tide, all this is filled in, and these are just little lagoons where animals can spawn. It turns out that this is this part of San Francisco that has the most amount of butterflies. There's lots of animals living there, lots of shellfish. Anyway, she just basically made a kind of habitat for animals. And I don't know if anyone is from San Francisco or knows San Francisco. This is Candlestick Park, so it's very close to a kind of public space. Okay, this is a work by Weiberger it's called but he had a garden in his backyard. He called it the Ruderal Society. And he went all around the world collecting plants and brought all of his plants back to the Ruderal garden. And this is a slideshow he does where he shows all 600 plants from his collection. But in 1997, he was invited to be in Documenta, and he wanted to do this thing. He proposed for Documenta that he would bring some of his live plants to Castle, where Documenta is held, and he planted them along this railway. It's no longer used for railway. They call it the Kulturbahnhof, the culture train station. And at first, the Germans were freaking out, like, because he's bringing all these invasive species from Balkans and Ukraine and Spain and Syria and Greece. You know what happens if these species get out and start populating all of Castle and they get out of control? But he was actually pretty convinced that they would just stay locally and they wouldn't really harm anything. And if anything, they contribute to biodiversity. And he has a really interesting, his take on his work is very different than my take on his work. He's interested in these species, bringing them together in Castle, because he's interested in the way seeds migrate and people migrate and species migrate. And he sees this as a kind of migration. And if you look at these, it's as if the people from the Balkans and the people from the Ukraine and the people from Spain and Syria and Greece have all migrated to Castle, and now they're living all together. So he saw it as a symbolism of this kind of the process of migration that brings all different kinds of people to a city. But what I like, or what I appreciate about it, is that he wasn't afraid of invasive species. And I think we talked earlier about kudzu, which is really a huge disaster. But at the same time, a lot of times invasive species are not huge disasters. A lot of times in the early part of the millennium, there was a trend to get rid of invasive species, and everyone was going around ripping up invasive species and replacing them with native plants. And in fact, they found out that it often disrupted the ecosystem, that the invasives had come along, they'd made friends with the natives, they were in their own kind of balance. It wasn't the original balance, it was a new balance, and getting rid of them created a kind of a imbalance or ecosystem malfunctioning. And so what I like about this garden, I think it's a great example for people who are, let's call them invasive species skeptics, to see that in fact it's possible for invasive species to thrive amongst each other in a kind of a non-native situation. So I think the piece took on two different meanings, because as time went on, when he first did it, everyone was against invasive species, but as time went on, people started to appreciate invasive species more. So this is the artist I was talking about earlier, who only makes art for animals. And she likes to find a space that's lacking in habitat, and then add habitat so that animals have a place to spawn and to rest. Like, for example, early on, she noticed that eagles and all sorts of species were gravitating to the top of telephone poles and electric poles, which was really dangerous. So she started installing some of her sculptures near them so that they would draw the animals to the sculptures instead of to the electric poles. Or I guess they're electric towers, telephone poles. This is Mei-Ling Hom is an artist who lives in Philadelphia, and she was invited to do an installation, I think a temporary outdoor piece. And she came up with this idea. She knew of a way to find 285 different trees of Asian origin in Philadelphia. So she made this kind of garden to sort of indicate to people that there's already 285 invasive species in Philadelphia. I'm not sure it's 285 different species, but the point is that it really, I guess people don't really imagine that there's already so many different kinds of foreign species until they're faced with them in a situation like this. So anyway, but what's interesting is that after she grew these 285 trees, it's a temporary piece. It was only for 1994. Then she invited the people of Philadelphia to each come and adopt one. So it had a kind of a second life. All these trees are still living. Well, I don't know that they're all living, but most of them are probably still living somewhere in Philadelphia, spread out around the town. So the Harrison studio lived in, well, the female, Helen is dead, but Newton is still alive. And Newton lives in Santa Cruz. And I think that they're probably, well, they're one of the major forces in American art history in terms of ecological artworks. And in 1995, they were invited to propose a housing development in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands had a plan. They needed to add something like 1 million new homes, and they didn't know where to put these 1 million homes. And they just made it like an open call. So the Harrisons participated with an architect and an ecologist, and they came up with the idea that instead of like just okay, all of this is effectively farmland. And they came up with the idea that instead of taking out the farm and putting in the houses, they would put the houses around the farmland. So they would fit 600,000 different houses in this ring. And then it would give them access to all the major cities. So if you can imagine the ring is here, you can get easily to Amsterdam, you can easily to Utrecht, you can get easy to Leiden, Den Haag, and Rotterdam. So instead of creating another urban space in the middle of this farmland. And initially their proposal was accepted, but I haven't really heard much about it in recent years. And it was called the Green Heart of Holland, which is anyway the name that a KLM pilot had given to this farmland ages ago. Okay, I told you for 1 minute about Brandon Ballinger, that he was one of the only artists that I knew about working on biodiversity back in the day. Well, 20 years ago when I started working, when I did the first book. And Brandon got involved in working with this project because he was working with a scientist and they were doing species counts of frogs. And he started noticing that different kinds of frogs had multiple limbs. What could be the reason why they had multiple limbs? Is it fertilizer runoff? Is it pesticides? Is it, what's going on? And they were, first they did all the counts at all different places around the country. And then they started coming up with theories. And they realized that their theory, maybe it's changed, but their theory at the time was that when the frog is a tadpole, there's a, what do you call it? A parasite called the trematode. And that parasite will live inside the tadpole. And wherever it lives, the tadpole, or when it becomes a frog, it grows a limb. So what happened when there was a trematode explosion, there were many more parasites. So many more parasites went to live in the frogs, and then they grew many more limbs. And they have since gone around. Oh, Brandon, you have to see his website. He's a masterful artist. He happens to have a PhD in biology, and he actually has a living space in Louisiana. But anyway, well, it was my point about Brandon. He's definitely one of the leading artists working in the field of biology and art. Another project from Herman de Vries. This is the guy who did the earth rubbings. So in 96, he was invited to do a public artwork in this new town. It's called Wateringse near Den Haag. It was a totally new town. They built it from scratch and they needed public art, whatever. And so they invited him to be the public artist. And he came up with this fantastic idea. And it was that each street would have a different tree species. So as a result, the city with 400 streets became a kind of arboretum, right? Instead of going to the arboretum to look at tree species, you could just wander around the city and you would see 400 different species on 400 different streets. But unfortunately, they didn't name the streets after the species. Like normally you'd have Cherry Street, Walnut Street, those kinds of things. Birch Street. They didn't do that. They gave them different names. And so the people apparently didn't make a connection, because when I went to make these photographs and I said to the people, like, wow, it's so cool. You live in this city where all the trees are the same on the street and they're all different. They looked up, they're like, wow, I never noticed that. So there's something lost on the population, but I think it's a beautiful idea, the Bowman Museum. That just means tree museum. But I think he was inspired from pieces like this one, where he would go for a walk in the woods and he would just collect one leaf from every different kind of tree that he saw. And then he would come home and make a kind of collage out of them. And he would call those things just like, yeah, from the forest floor. So just simply like a day in the life of a walk in the forest. And he has a fantastic website. I highly, if you're interested in trees and leaves and earth rubbings, I highly recommend going to his website. It's like a catalog raisonné. This George Simon is a Swiss artist who spent 9 years working with the Komi people, and the Komi people live in the Ural Mountains. And George was really worried that these people, well, first of all, where they live is the largest virgin forest in Europe. And of course, in the 90s, when he started working with them, as Russia started opening up to business, well, the USSR broke up in the early 90s. And then 5 years later is when George started working with the Komi people who lived in the most eastern part of Russia. It's so east, it's practically China. He really wanted to go there and help the people to map all their berries, he was really worried, just as I said at the very beginning, that if you lose your language, you lose your access to your species, to your knowledge. And he was afraid that what would happen is that oil companies would move in, foresters would move in, every extractive industries, everyone would destroy their forest, and they would have nothing left and nothing to fight for. So he sort of wanted to give them the tools to defend their forest against capitalism, for lack of a better word, and also to use their language and their knowledge to preserve and to record what they have so that it won't go away. Anyway, it was a very successful work. The people were very happy with what they learned, or not with what they learned, but with what they recorded. All right, so this is Kundan Mekala again, the guy with the chickens. He has been doing projects where he feeds the chickens mushrooms, and then he feeds the people the eggs made from the chickens who ate the mushrooms. He calls them super shrooms and super eggs. It's just kind of fun. This was a pop-up restaurant at the Venice Biennale. Henrik Håkansson has been working in biodiversity for a long time. He first did a little, he did a sort of, what do you call it? A little garden that was totally fenced in, and you could only experience it through telescopes. And now he has a reserve in the middle of a sculpture park in Sweden called Wanash Kunst. And on this side, inside the forest, it's totally left to its own, what do you call it? Its own device. The people are not allowed to enter, and the people who run the forest are not allowed to do any clearings or cuttings or anything. Whereas on this side, it's totally a managed forest. So what's nice is you can walk along and you can look inside and you can really see the difference between an unmanaged forest and a managed forest. And let's see, this is a Brazilian artist, Maria Theresa Alves, she was mining seeds from the bay of the water in Bristol. I think it's a bay. Anyway, Bristol in the UK. She mined the seeds that had been brought there as ballast, and then she made this kind of floating garden out of her seeds. And she wanted to show that the seeds living at the bottom of the bay were still alive, because people don't think of seeds as being able to be alive for a couple hundred years. They would have been dropped there in the late 18th century and the early 19th century, because Bristol was part of the slave trade. The slaves would come, they would come first from Africa. How did this go? I had it worked out. The boat would come from the States, from the New World to the UK. It went from Africa. Wait a minute, why am I getting confused? Oh yeah, it went from Africa to the New World, then the New World to the UK. Well, I don't know how, I'm so embarrassed. Anyway, I'll tell you how it functioned. In the UK, they got all the things that they were going to sell to the people in the New World, but they also brought the slaves to the New World. I can't remember how anyway, but I'll think about it. And in the Q of A, I'll make a diagram and I'll figure it out. But anyway, it was part of the slave trade. And as a result, I know, I got it. So the boat would come from the New World empty, but it would be full of ballast. And then they would dump the ballast and they would put all sorts of things that were manufactured in the UK into the boat. Then they would take the boat and they would take it to maybe it went from the New World to Africa. Oh, now I'm getting confused again. Oh well, I will remember it. It's just somehow it's not coming back to me. Okay, this is Jackie Bruckner. She was invited to do. This was a wastewater treatment plant that had a migratory birds going over it, and they wanted to turn it from a migratory bird place to a bird watching sanctuary. So she built with local art students and scientists these 3 artificial reefs or artificial islands. 2 of them are for the purpose of cleaning the water, and 1 of them is for the purpose of spawning, for birds to land and for species in the water to reproduce. And this is a piece from Annemarie Maas, who's a Belgian artist, and she's a beekeeper. And on the left is a piece that she made called The Transparent Beehive, where bees can come from outside and live in her hive and then go back outside and get the nectar from the plants and come back in the hive and make their beehive, and the human beings can watch it happening. It's live. And then more recently, she was invited to do a sculpture in Hamburg, and she built this sculpture using robots to carve it. It was carved with robots, but then inside is a hive. So at the bottom here is the hole where the bees can leave, and there's a hive that's been put inside it. And the idea is that that these bees are swarming all over Hamburg, and they're actually maybe moving. This hive could swarm and move to another location and could move to another location. This is a Danish Swedish artist who lives in Berlin, and she's really into potato farming and potato diversity, because the EU is very controlling over which species of potatoes can be grown. And as a result, she's trying to alert people to the fact that there actually isn't in the world. There's a great potato diversity, and there's many different kinds of potatoes, but in fact we're only ever eating 6 to 8 different kinds of potatoes, and that's a huge problem, because if one of the potatoes could go extinct, then we don't have the diversity we need. And she's trying to put pressure on the EU to make greater diversity. This is the Swiss artist Christian Philipp Müller, who made the Swiss chard fairy. And Swiss chard and potatoes are kind of the opposite, because potatoes are so popular and so eaten and so traded, they're more watched. Whereas Swiss chard, I did see them at the Kroger's here in Houston. I was surprised, because you don't usually see Swiss chard in a grocery store. But in general, they're far less regulated, because they're not such a staple. And as a result, there's lots of different species, and he here showed that there was at least 85 species that he could grow on this kind. This was a kind of a bridge to cross the Fulda during Documenta. This is a British artist, Rebecca Chesney, who actually made a blue meadow and a yellow meadow that were adjacent. It doesn't happen so much this way. This is 2012. And over the years, they started blooming at different times. So here, for example, in 2015, it's all yellow. but it's not blue. But in the years where you did have the blue meadow adjacent the yellow meadow, she could hire a scientist to see what animals, which insects preferred the blue flowers and which insects preferred the yellow flowers. And if you remember at the very beginning of my talk, I talked about those artists and who made the cornflower, which is blue for the honeybees. You can see cornflower is the number one, the favorite species of the under the blue flowers. So as it turns out, honeybees and hoverflies flit side to side, though bumblebees prefer blue flowers. So this, where the corn marigold is the yellow. I don't know. Is there a way to see what this flit side is? Anyway, bumblebees, the hoverflies are more kind of ambidextrous. Hoverflies and honeybees are kind of ambidextrous, but bumblebees prefer blue flowers. Okay. And this is an artist during the International Year of Beans, which was 2016. Pulses is the British way that you say like legume. He grew this kind of bio-intense farm of different kinds of beans. I think there's 16 different species to create this kind of edible environment where he imagined people just sitting here and grabbing the beans off the bean stalks and eating them. And this is finally the last project. This is me. This is Jean-Francois, my husband. This is us getting our chicken, Maria Theresa. And this is us giving some of her offspring away. People have found out that we have these biodiverse chickens and they want them. And what's crazy about the biodiverse chickens is that when they do have babies, you have no clue what you're going to have. So like this is an example. This is one, well, it's not a litter, it's a cluck. But, you know, in any kind of given litter, we'll have brown ones and black ones and white ones. And they change so much from babies over their lifetime. It's amazing how much chickens change in color. Anyway, that is my last slide. I see there's lots of questions. There's 56 in the chat. Is that right?
There's lots of questions. So thank you so much.
Okay. All right. I'm going to work out the middle passage. I will figure this out because
I think it was Britain or Europe, and then it went to North America or Cuba or Haiti, and then it went to Africa. Is it the triangle slave trade you're talking?
Yes, I know, but the slaves went directly to the New World, right? So the boat went, I think the boat went New World to the UK. The thing that I know is that in the UK, they filled it up with things that they manufactured in the UK because they didn't have factories in the colonies. All the like silver factories and those kinds of things were put in the boats and sold. And then they go, then maybe they put them in the boat and then maybe they put the slaves in the, I didn't, I'll have to work
We
it
can
out.
look that up.
I don't know why.
Okay. We do have lots of questions. The first one I wanted to ask is, have you ever met with Indigenous leaders to see how biodiversity can be incorporated into our daily lives?
That would be a dream. I need to do that. That's a really good question. I'm very interested in Indigenous people. I just proposed an exhibition that would involve, so this is a proposal. I doubt it will get accepted, but this was something I was thinking of. It's for a biennial that's in Norway. And you might have heard of the Sami people in the Arctic Circle. They're called the Samis. And what's interesting is that the Samis have different dialects. So I proposed an exhibition of Sami people, biodiversity and their languages to make some sort of understanding of the role of dialect and the role of biodiversity. So if that were to work out, then of course I would get to meet with Indigenous people. But it's interesting. I just was on the CAA conference last week, and every person is announcing where the lands that they're on that were ceded from which tribe. Mm-hmm. So I had to quickly look that up. The Akatapa Indians. I hadn't even heard of the Akatapa. But anyway, Northern Houston had the. But anyway, it would be a dream, and it's something I should pursue, but I haven't. I've been too focused on art, but
Yeah. We also have, there's a lot of questions around art and science, and both advice on bringing them together as artists, and also maybe how do you make distinctions between scientist and artist, or engineering and beauty, I guess.
okay.
So maybe
Well,
one is just like, yeah, advice about how to bring those
okay,
two areas
okay.
together.
First of all, if scientists aren't really aware of the history of eco art, their first assumption is that they're going to get you to make a nice graph or a nice title, you know, a sign for their project or whatever. But I find that the absolutely best art projects, art science projects, are where, in a weird way, the artist builds the experiments. That, you know, the artist and the scientist work together. The artist builds the experiments because artists are good at building things, and the scientist does the research inside the artwork. And I'll give you a really great example. I wish I could get you an image. I could get you an image, I guess, on Google. But so I had, in one exhibition I did in Germany 2 years ago, we had an ecologist working with an artist. And this ecologist, he does research on decay, on the decay rates of wood in a forest. Like, for example, the tree fell down, some wood is already decayed and is and when it's decaying, it's in a process of nourishing the land. Or example, let's just talk about the example we already know. We already know this example of Rebecca. So in a weird way, you could say Rebecca built the experiment, right? She built that meadow. She came up with the idea of the meadow. She planted it, and she made it possible for scientists to do their research in her sculpture, or if you land art, whatever you want to call it. So anyway, I think the best examples are ones where the artist works with the scientist from the very beginning and discovers what it is that the scientist wants. What is the scientist's goal? What is the science trying to research? And then the artist can propose a way to tackle the experiment. And the thing that's great is that about this is because not, I mean, of course, maybe tree scientists are used to working outside, but not every scientist is used to working outside. A lot of them do lab work, and these kinds of artists can, you know, help them work outside on a scale that is different. So my first advice to artists is get with the scientists from the very beginning, discuss the project, think of yourself as a co-creator, a co-scientist. Be clear that you're not there to make their project look pretty or make their project look easy for the public to understand, that you are interested in science and you are interested to participate in the experiment. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that, you know, this art science conversation comes up a lot. I have yet to meet a scientist who wasn't kind of baffled by the artist, but also extremely appreciative. They usually the artist will say, oh, why don't we do this? And the the scientist is like, well, I've never done that before. I never heard that done. For example, Lynn Hall, the artist who does the artworks for animals, when she started putting up her different posts around to get species, she was working with the US scientists on these different areas, and they all were like, oh, we never heard of this, but why not? You know, if this will help us save some endangered eagle, well, let's try it. There's nothing to lose. And usually art projects are really inexpensive compared to science projects. Artist budgets are almost, with the exception of that coral reef that supposedly cost $3 million, usually artists are like, oh, I can do something interesting for $10,000. I mean, $10,000 is peanuts for a scientist. So I'm just saying that luckily the artists, if they bring their interesting, novel, fresh idea to the scientist, then the scientist might be really open to it. And I definitely encourage. And like I said earlier, a lot of times artworks are funded in ways that science experiments wouldn't be. A great example is Mel Chin's Revival Field, which he worked with a scientist to test plants absorbing metals, heavy metals. And as an art project, the scientist he worked with had been trying to do this experiment for 20 years of his life and could not get any funding. And then as an art project, they got funding. So that's something that's actually really wonderful. Like science, not only if you get funding, do you have to pay it back? You not only have to prove that your proposal worked, but oftentimes scientists have to pay back their scientific awards. Whereas artists, if it doesn't work as science, the artist can just say, "Oh, that was a great art project." I mean, so far that has never happened. I've never heard. Well, there have been art projects that didn't work as they were intended, but for the most part, no one's had to cop out and say, "Oh, well, it's a great art project, but a terrible science project." But it's something you can fall back on if needs be. Engineering versus science versus art. Okay. Well, first of all, like a scientist, the same project can have multiple agendas, let's say. So the art agenda would be, I want to see this. I've never seen it before. I've never seen a sculpture that attracts endangered eagles. I've never seen a sculpture that absorbs plants. The same reason we make artworks, because we have something we want to make that we've never experienced before. We want to experience something different, right? So that agenda is there for the artist. They want to experience something that they think is interesting. Where the agenda for the scientist is like, I want to create an experiment that I can test and I can prove and I can write a paper and I can defend it and I can or analyze the data. So they have different agendas, but I think it's the same. My first exhibition, the Ecovention, a lot of people said this isn't really art, this is really science. But I think that artists and scientists are working so differently, and that's why I sort of changed it to this an ecovention being a practical action with ecological intent, because I think the practicality is really important. I don't think that these artists doing these projects with scientists are doing them for poetic purposes. Anyway, and thinking of art as practical is very complicated. A lot of people have huge problems with art being practical. But what I find the case about, even if it's practical and even if the artist has a goal and the goal might not work, the meaning of the artwork is changing. And that's interesting to me, because since it's an artwork, its meaning can change. Science doesn't have meaning and it doesn't change over time. So the same experiment, you might look at the data differently over time, but you're not going to try to be reinterpreting a scientific experiment over and over and over.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Only one?
We could talk if you're willing to stay.
Yeah,
that's
I can
great.
stay.
Okay.
I'm
going to choose. There's a couple questions just about being a curator and how do you look? What do you look for with artists? How do you find the artists that you?
That's a great question, and especially when I had when I worked on Ecovention Europe, because so over the years I had already been making a list of artists. Ecovention Europe wasn't European artists; it was projects that had taken place in Europe, right? So I had already been making my list of different artists over the time, and I think I had something like 65 artists by the time I was approached. But I didn't really have a complete list. I knew there was things going on in Italy and Poland, and I knew that there were, I know always that I'm going to miss things, that I know that my research is incomplete. What I always hope is that I can initiate some research, that I can spark some research, and that other people can fill in the dots. But anyway, so I just started asking different people in different countries, I'm working on this show. Is there any artist that you think is relevant that I should know about? In the historical works, I looked through tons and tons of catalogs. Like for example, I've found lots of things scattered in Venice Biennale catalogs that no one even knew was ecological art. A lot of things gets done with living animals and living plants, and people just exhibit it, but they don't even know its purpose or its role or its meaning. It's kind of wild. So once you start focusing on these kinds of projects, you realize that they're all around, but they're kind of misdiagnosed or misunderstood or mislabeled maybe, or whatever. So anyway, it's just research. It's research. It's um, word of mouth, but it's not. Yeah, but it's a very imperfect process. I mean, I have to hope for other people to finish what I've been unable to finish.
Thanks. There's a lot of questions just about how did you get started in your research on biodiversity, whether it was one thing that sparked that or one
Well, I think
inspiration, or yeah.
it was the biodiversity. Okay, so this in the Ecovention book, there were 5 different chapters. There was biodiversity was one, but there was also reclamation, urban infrastructure, awareness, activism, and there's a 5th topic that's escaping my mind. But the point I want to bring up is that it was really this quote of this relationship between language and biodiversity that really stuck in my brain, and that's what made me more interested. That's what made me think that biodiversity is really interesting. And what I love is that it really gives a reason for cities to offer elementary school in 20 different languages. You know what I mean? It's like we can't just have, well, it's a good idea for everyone to learn English eventually, but it's also a good idea for everyone to keep their birth language or their secondary language or whatever, because every time you make every nation state that becomes monolingual loses a lot, and they turn out to be not very biodiverse. So I was really interested to make that claim where you could appreciate the fact that there's so many different people living together, and that's a benefit to us, not a disadvantage or a cost.
There's several questions just asking what can young artists or college students do to help with biodiversity, and I guess linguistic diversity too. Yeah.
Don't kill insects. That's the first thing. Learn to pick them up and put them out. And even when your friends are scared to death of bees, learn to pick up bees, put them outside. I think that, all of us have our own paths for gaining respect for our environments, and yeah, I don't know. It's very difficult to know all the details, but I think if you're thinking about art projects, I guess, if there's some sort of pet animal that you have that you think is underappreciated, to do a project about that underappreciated animal would already be a great start in thinking about biodiversity, because in so many cases over the last 30 years, a lot of that's the fifth category in my book was valuing anew. In so many cases, there were artists who would just point out the value of something that everyone thought was ridiculous or horrible or an eyesore, and in fact, for example, in Houston, in my parents' previous home, I found a gecko. The gecko is still living, and I was really wanting to make a movie of the gecko. A gecko is like looks like a lizard. He's very short. They call them house insects in Texas because they're everywhere. And I mean, the good thing is they eat the insects. The bad thing is they leave their droppings everywhere. But anyway, so I saw this little gecko and I was like, oh, how cool. I want to make a movie. And of course he played dead. And then he wouldn't move, so I couldn't make a movie. But then I took him out of the house. But then I started researching the house geckos. And I saw that like most people try to kill them. I'm just saying that there are things in our environment that are helpful and that people always try to get rid of. So I think starting to see the things that we immediately imagine are harmful and doing a little research to decide, are they really so harmful? What are their benefits? Sharing that knowledge with your friends, all of that can go really far in terms of improving biodiversity as a young artist, as anybody, anyway. But you can make artworks about them, these pet species you have, or you can have them as your pets. I mean, I'm not someone who's against, zoos or pets. I had someone tried to tell me that Anyway, there's lots of people that are adamantly against zoos. I'm in favor of them, not because they cage animals, that's horrible, but because they do create an awareness and they do help on species reclamation. I mean, they do help with endangered species. So I think the more information and I don't know, I there's just a lot of people that think all that matter are humans. So the fewer people like that, the better we will be. So whatever you can do to discourage people from being so obsessed with human beings would be great.
And thinking about valuing anew, I mean, we've had some pretty intense experiences this past year, and there are a couple questions that how do you think COVID-19 has affected biodiversity? And I don't want to smush things together too much, but also just thinking about, someone asked about the recent crisis in Texas and how that event maybe would impact your work. Yeah.
Well, okay, so it remains to be seen. We know, for example, well, there's some, okay, it hasn't totally been proven. Like last summer, there was a lot of news stories about how all of a sudden different kinds of species, like the monkeys in Thailand and the in the Venice Lagoon, there were all different kinds of species people were seeing. Last summer, we were told that in fact, with the lockdown and with fewer humans, animals, and there were more different kinds of animals visible than normal, right? Then as time went on, some people said, oh, that was just kind of a fake news. That was a kind of interesting news story, right? A blip. Now, I have actually never really did further research. I was really excited by the fact that the lockdown would somehow free animals to roam the cities and do all sorts of crazy things. But I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's just simply fake news or really true. But we do know that now they're actually saying that last year had warming because there were many more sunny days. That's interesting, right? So we had the lockdown and we had the people moving about less and there were more sunny days. But it remains to be seen whether in fact this kind of global snowstorm, I mean, it's not just affecting Texas, it's affecting the Northwest in America, the Northeast in America, and also Europe. Europe is having more snow than normal. Now, I haven't seen any kind of some sort of speculation that there's a relationship between the lockdown and this snowstorm. However, what I do know about snow is that actually snow is a wonderful thing because it melts slowly and it seeps into the ground. Like rain is it's not horrible, but rain tends to run off. It doesn't really soak into the ground. We will have a very, very wonderfully lush year this year with the snow because snow is the most wonderful thing for agriculture that there is. I know lots of, in Texas, they're worried that the celery is dying. Okay, yes, the freeze is killing lots of plants now that were already budding or whatever, but for the ones that are not budding, they will have very rich, moist soil this year. So that's a good thing. But I don't know that anyone is I mean, they're calling this what, Uri? The storm is called Uri. Did you hear that?
I didn't know it had a name. So
Uri is the name.
Big enough to get a name. Yeah.
Uri is the name of the storm. I don't know whether Uri is a byproduct of COVID, but of course they're saying this extreme weather is a byproduct of climate change. So, but I would like to say something about 2020. I'd like to say two things. My takeaway message from from COVID-19 in 2020 was that I learned that what we as humans have to learn more than anything else is that we do not have a right to buy whatever we can afford. I think until the pandemics hit, all of us lived our lives that whatever we could afford, we had a right to. If we could afford 3 homes, okay, we have a right to 3 homes. If we can afford a giant car or to fly first class or whatever. But I think that the pandemic taught us that it's actually not even that fun to live that way. It's maybe more fun to live in a way where you're like, okay, what should I buy? Or what should I have? Or what should I own? Or, what are the ramifications of of my actions. And the reason I bring this up is because I'm really interested in I was really interested last year by all the discussion of people's psychological problems, like how much they suffered because they couldn't go out for dinner, or they couldn't meet with their friends, or they couldn't go to the bar, or they couldn't go to the movies, or they could. It seemed like we as humans had evolved to this point where we got some sort of satisfaction from our consumption patterns and our consumption capacity. And if we weren't living at full capacity, if we weren't able to consume at full capacity, then we were somehow unhappy. And that really showed me that if we tie our happiness or our well-being to, what we think we ought to consume, it's a really detrimental way to live. Not only are you likely to become increasingly unhappy as we have more pandemics and more restrictions and try to fight climate change, but I think like I said, I think we have to turn this around. I think we have to say, instead of living to how we think we can, instead of living like we have a right to whatever we can afford, I think we have to live like we have a right to make a decision about what we ought to consume, or what is the smartest way to consume. And the second thing I learned last year was, I think artists have a lot to teach people about how to live working at home and not. I mean, I'm obviously discounting all the families with two people working at home and their kids at home and having to teach their kids. I'm not talking about that stressful situation. I'm talking about the more basic situation where people just could not stay home, and being at home was a huge, what's the word? Maybe it's tedious. I don't know whether it's tedious or boring, or just the idea of feeling trapped at home. And when you see so many people feeling trapped, then you realize, wow, artists work in their studio for 15 hours a day and they never feel trapped. Of course, they're doing what they want to do, but maybe makers, artists, people with a real, some sort of creative focus in their lives can actually become a model so that people could become more comfortable living at home for long periods of time. I don't know. It's something I thought a lot about. And the third thing is, I definitely think the artist's lifestyle is a kind of model for climate. We're going to have to go from having carbon footprints of 20,000 to having carbon footprints of 1,000. And I think that, we're all going to have to be role models for the people that are only trained to spend their money and don't have the same creative energy that we do. I mean, it seems to be people either spend money or make things, or write things or whatever. The point is that I think more people are going to have to become like us if we're really going to defeat climate change.
It sounds great. I'm all for it. So I'm all for that. Yeah.
It's not really the view everyone will be an artist. I don't have that view, but I have the view that we have to really become comfortable with our environments. Whatever that is, we can't just look at the world as entertainment, and how is it going to entertain us, and how are we going to go out and consume entertainment and consume all the things that keep us busy, because it's just, the future isn't going to, well, it's going to become more restrictive before it becomes less restrictive. I hate to say that. I do not have a pessimistic view, because I was never unhappy last year. I have a kind of I actually never had a busier year in my life as I did last year, by staying at home every day for 9 months.
All right. Well, I think we are out of time. So thank you so much.
Oh, my
this
pleasure.
was just a really great talk, and a great discussion as well. And I appreciate your generosity and everything you brought to us.
Okay.
So
Thank you so much.
thank you so much, Sue. And thank you everyone that attended tonight. So,
and if anyone has a dying question I didn't answer, feel free to email me. I'm easy to find and I will answer your question. No worries.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.